I'm glad to be back with you again this week, and I'm looking forward to this sermon I'm going to share with you. It's called After the Rapture, and we're going to look at what happens after the rapture. You say, well, that doesn't affect me because I'm going up in the rapture. Well, things are going to happen that you need to know about, and they really are vital for how you operate right in these days. Now, let me just say something. Typically, I go through a book of the Bible verse by verse. And before the COVID-19 shutdown occurred, I was rolling through Ephesians, and I'm looking forward to getting back to that. But I was asked to do something on the end times because this is a question that is on the mind of many people. So I started out, we got into the rapture, we continued into another one. Now I'm doing after the rapture, and I'm going to try to finish this before they reopen the churches. If not, I'll finish it once our church opens. And I very likely will continue to do these half-hour, 40-minute films and post this on YouTube and on my Facebook because I'm just getting a tremendous response from people. They are hitting me with questions that I'm going to answer today and next week and probably the week after that. Now, one more thing I'm going to do that I think is really, really important, and that is dealing with something that I've been writing for the last couple of years for the Village News. The Village News is a local paper. It's not a Christian paper. It's a community paper, and they've asked me to write a pastor's column, and I share some thoughts that are very pastoral for people. And this week I'm going to be posting one that is set up for Mother's Day, but I'm going to deal with grandmothers in the Bible, how to be a great grandmother. And so I'm going to start posting those weekly on my Facebook page. So if you'd like to see them, this one's going to be all about grandmothers. We'll get it on there hopefully this Tuesday. Now, having said that, let's get to work on after the rapture. This is really an important subject to look at. It's interesting that just this week, a couple days ago, I was watching the morning news, and they had a breaking news that the Defense Department and the Navy had released video of sightings of UFOs. And I'm watching those and I'm saying this is fascinating. And here's what and people ask me about UFOs. What are they? I don't know if I can give you a comprehensive answer. I don't know if anybody can. But here's what I do know. Most of them are bogus. Many of them are just misunderstood natural phenomena. But there appear to be some that really are hard to explain. And the question is, what's going on here? And we've got, is it a sign of the end? Are we going to be invaded by aliens? What's going on? And you put that together with what's going on medically with this pandemic. When we look at what's going on in our country economically, when we look at the fact that every church in America is shut down right now. And as I drove into work, I hear about the shutdown of California beaches, specifically Newport Beach and Huntington Beach. And there are a lot of really irritated people over some of these things. They feel like they're being picked on. Well, I'm not going to run to their defense. I'm not going to talk about that. But I'm going to ask this question and try to answer it. Is God getting ready to establish his kingdom on this earth? You say, okay, his kingdom. What is his kingdom? Well, many of you have been praying for his kingdom to come all your life. As a matter of fact, for the last 2,000 years, people have been praying, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So they've been praying for his kingdom to come, and many of them have no idea what that kingdom is going to look like. And what signs are there that the kingdom is drawing near? I'll address the kingdom a little later, but let me talk about the single greatest sign that the kingdom is getting closer. Jesus was speaking to his disciples, and he told this parable in Luke 21. He said, look at the fig tree and all the trees. Okay, look at the fig tree and all the trees. And when they sprout leaves, you can see for yourself and know that summer is near. Anybody that understands trees knows that's true. It's springtime right now, and the trees are all sprouting. And we know that summer is near. He goes on, though. Even so, when you see these things happening, things he just talked about, you know that the kingdom of God is near when the fig tree starts to come alive. Now you say, okay, Rick, that's great. What is the fig tree? Well, through the Bible, and especially in the New Testament, the fig tree is speaking of Israel. Make no mistake about that. Very few would dispute that. And in 70 AD, the Jews were really slaughtered by Titus, who was soon to be emperor of Rome. 70 AD. They were dispelled from the land. More than 1 million Jews were killed. We call that the diaspora, where the Jews were scattered all over the world, and they still are. Their country was taken away from them, and for nearly 2,000 years, there was no Israel, the home of the Jews. It looked like the fig tree was dead. And it got even worse as Hitler came along. And as 1945 came along, 6 out of 10 million Jews in Europe had been slaughtered through the Holocaust of the Nazis. And then a shock came. The shock was in May 14, 1948. The sap started flowing. All of a sudden, at what we would probably consider the least opportune time or the least feasible time, Israel was back in existence and the Jews had their own land. Well, since then, it's been 72 years this month. Their neighbors, who vastly outnumber them, have been attempting to drive them out of the land, and it hasn't happened. God's hand is upon the nation of Israel. That is the single greatest sign that we are so much closer to the end times than any of the generations before us. Because before 72 years ago, people would look at that prophecy about Israel and the tribulation, say that can't be possible. There is no Israel. There are no Jews living in the land. All of that has changed. It's interesting. Previous generations have looked at the prophecies throughout the Bible, not just in the book of Revelation, and they were baffled and they were confused. Because for the last 100 years ago, they would look at something where it says an army from the east of 200 million would descend upon the Middle East. Well, that wasn't possible. There wasn't a population that would support that. Well, there is today. They would look at it 100 years ago that these pandemics that are mentioned in the Bible in end times, they would say there's no way it could spread that quickly. Well, with air travel now, we are one flight away from a pandemic, as we have seen, spreading all over the world. And the scale of destruction, you look at the book of Revelation and the chapters on the destruction, and people would say, well, that isn't possible that a third of the population could be destroyed. And now with our nuclear weapons, we realize that that is at least feasible. Even in my lifetime. Let me talk to you about what has happened in my lifetime. You see, I was born after Israel came into existence. And we now have the ability to spy on people everywhere through global satellites. Most major cities have cameras everywhere. And this didn't happen until the last couple of decades. People can be communicated with almost instantaneously around the world. Well, that has to happen in the tribulation. Wasn't feasible before I was born. And then we have computers, we have smartphones. Everybody is in touch with everybody. We have drones as well as stationary cameras watching over everything. We have also seen that we now have the ability to regulate how people buy without money by using either credit cards or chips or embedded chips in the wrist or things like that. That technology is now here. And whereas before people would look at the mark of the beast, the 666, and how you couldn't shop or buy without that, and we say, well, I don't understand that. Well, with barcodes and everything else, we have that ability now. It is now feasible. One of the things I want to say is, the reason I believe these days are closer is because of the feasibility of what is going to happen in the tribulation. Up until our generations, we looked at that and said, doesn't make sense. But since Israel's been back in the land, It's all starting to become very, very feasible. Now, the rapture can happen at any time. Anytime. Don't need a sign. It could happen today. It could happen before I'm done with this and you're listening to it. However, no signs, but after that, there is the tribulation, and now all the signs are pointing to the fact that that is a reality, very much so. Even with the nations, one of the things you're going to see, I'm going to point to it today from Ezekiel, is the fact that there will be a major coalition of nations that will descend upon Israel. America seems to be out of the picture. No more America. And so you say, well, Russia and Iran, we have them by their old names, Persia being the name for Iran, they are in a coalition and they attack Israel. Well, that didn't seem like a reality because those two nations were never linked at the hip before, but they are today. Again, more feasibility. And then just in the last couple of months in our country, we have seen our democracy, which is the greatest independent country on the face of the globe, accept government control and oversight like we never would have dreamed would happen, where the government has shut down every church. And by the way, I understand the medical reasons for this. I'm not disputing that. But I'm looking at this from a prophetic point of view and saying that appears in the tribulation, and it is happening, and people have accepted it in a country that is the most vehemently independent. Businesses being closed down, and as I said, beaches being closed down. There's a desire for world peace. People are willing to sell out on everything to get peace and security. But above all, the sign of all signs is that fig tree. And the fact that Israel is in the land, and not just in the land, they are prospering in the land. Just read an article about how well they are doing as a country. And so we're going to talk about all of these signs need to happen so that we can say, you know what? The rapture comes before all of this. It may not be far off. Now, let me talk a little bit. As I started to do this, and I'm going to get on some tangents. I usually don't do that when I'm preaching, but I'm going to do this because of the situation we're in. I want to talk about the impact of the rapture. We talked about the rapture the last 2 weeks. The question is, what impact will that have? What will life be like right after? What about the day after the rapture? What will be going on this earth? And you say, and what will America's role be in time prophecies? And I'll be candid with you. I know different people have come up with theories about how America may be there, and they're under different categories. I don't see America there. If they're there, they're not clearly there. And so the question is, right after the rapture, does the rapture take down America? That's a big question. The day after the rapture, what will our country look like? If it were to happen today, it would hit. If it happened today, believers from all over the globe would be taken out of the picture. And next week, I'm going to talk about, well, how does anybody get saved if we're gone and the restrainer restrains no more? I'm going to hit that next week. But if the rapture were to happen today, what would America look like the next day? And how would it affect all of the superpowers, those nations that are around Israel? I'm going to tell you, blanket statement, we would be devastated, whereas it would just be a little nick on others because of the number of believers in our country, and especially the number of believers in our military, and the number of believers in leadership in the United States of America. That is not true of those countries that would stand against us today. For example, Raymond Schaefer, my co-author, he sent me something. He was dealing with this question, and he gave me a bunch of bullet points. And he said, let's just imagine what America might look like. And here's what he said. Based on their own testimony of faith in Christ, both the President and Vice President of the United States would suddenly disappear. And the Speaker of the House would then be the acting authority. Several cabinet members, still reading his quotes, several cabinet members would also disappear. 2, 3, and maybe 4 Supreme Court justices would disappear. A meaningful minority of federal and state judges all over the country would disappear. Governors of states would disappear. Mayors of towns and cities would disappear. A minority of members in the U.S. House, U.S. Senate, as well as in their states would disappear. This is devastating. It's like decapitating the leadership of our country. And then a significant minority of the armed forces would disappear, including some of the most high-ranking officials in our military. And then firefighters and police officers and healthcare personnel at all levels, from paramedics to physicians of all types, would suddenly disappear. That's the day after the rapture. People are going to get up and say, we lost a huge number of our population, and we lost key leadership, and we lost military people. I work with the military out here, and I know how many good believers there are, and they would be decimated with the loss. One final quote from Ray. This one phenomenon all by itself could be absolutely catastrophic for life in America. Wow. Life after the rapture. Well, let me just go on a little bit further with that. And I'm doing a little imagining now. I'm taking what God says and then trying to, in my mind, fill in the blanks and say, what does life look like after that? Okay? Some of this you're going to say, he's been watching too much science fiction. Well, let's do a little imagining, okay? This is not speaking from the Word of God. This is from my just speculating on these. I would say that America would lose its position as a superpower. I believe the rapture will take America out of the picture. And I believe right now, when we talk about these UFOs, people watch. It's amazing how people are addicted to the ancient astronaut theorists, where they believe the aliens have been coming here, they're getting ready to abduct us. I listen to all of these abduction tales. I see all of the UFO reports. I hear all of this, and people really believe that we are being visited and they could abduct us. And I believe after the rapture, that may be one of the theories that is thrown around, that we have suffered an attack from aliens and they have abducted all of these people. I don't know. I'm speculating. And I know, as I said, I believe most UFO sightings are bogus. But let me go ahead and really give you a theory that I have not heard. Ray and I talked about this. The feasibility of it is Satan behind some of these UFO sightings? And is it possible that he is preparing this, which has been going on for centuries, by the way, so that people will have a way to say, well, those people that said Christ is returning for them and this is the rapture, that's not true. They were abducted by all those UFOs because we've got all this evidence. And you say, what are we seeing up there? Here's one I want you to deal with. I have watched programs. I watched Natalie Cole sing a duet with Nat King Cole. Well, he's dead. But through holograms, he was on the platform with him. I've seen Michael Jackson through hologram and Elvis Presley. They're not there, but they look so physical. And I was just speculating, if we're able to do that with holograms, Satan and his evil demons, who knows what they are projecting up there? Don't know. Speculating. But something to chew on for a while. By the way, Satan's got his eschatology right. Satan believes there will be a rapture. And so he has been preparing for this for a long time. Now, America. I believe, and I need to come on the record and let you know, I believe in America exceptionalism. I believe that God had his hand on the founding of this country. I believe God had a couple of purposes. Well, actually three I'm going to mention. Number one, God gave this country as a place for religious freedom. Very unusual at the time this country was started. Religious freedom. We cherish it. It's so precious. Secondly, this was the country, starting in the late 1800s, that sent missionaries around the world. And it is incredible to see the impact now, 100 years later, of the missionary activity. And so we look at this country and say, that's a unique role. But here's another one. America, for a third purpose, was the safe haven of the Jewish people and the one country that has always stood with Israel and has helped them survive. America, I believe, will be taken out. When the Christians are gone, I think God's going to say, I'm done with you guys. I'm done with you guys. Israel won't need you anymore. I've got it from here on out. I'm going to let this thing play out. But also, when I look at this, and this is something I added about a half hour before I put this thing together, because I look at America and the abortion that's been going on in America, the abortion that's been going on. In the past 60 days, we just lament that 60,000 Americans have died from COVID-19. Many or most of them elderly. During that same period of time, 250,000 of our babies have been killed in the womb through abortion. All right? 60,000 elderly, and yet we turn our backs and seem to ignore 250,000 babies, many of them near full term, that have been aborted. I've got more statistics here I won't go into. That's not the purpose of this sermon. But it is something to say that God, once the believers are taken out of here, who primarily stand against abortion, believe that these babies are created in the image of God, and that this Holocaust is equal as the atrocity in Germany with the Jews. I'll leave it right there. After the rapture, God may be done with America. If that were to happen, Israel is vulnerable. And Russia and Iran and others, I believe, I read in Ezekiel, that they turn on Israel. And you say, well, how can they get away with that with America here? America's gone. And so in Ezekiel, the latter part of it, we read about a battle where some of these forces, basically Muslim countries, try to finish Israel off. And they are unsuccessful. God protects Israel. He's got it from there. And then Israel turns to this guy called the Antichrist, and now we're in the tribulation. Now, here's something else. We remember it says, here's the sign of the coming kingdom, the fig tree and all the trees. Now, very few people will talk about the other trees, but he said there's a fig tree and all the trees. And if Israel is a nation, if the fig tree is a nation called Israel, who are the other trees? Well, here's what I'm going to do. And I'm starting to get signals that I'm running out of time, aren't I? I'm going to stretch this out a little bit longer, okay? First of all, a quick overview. The end times, 5 things you need to remember. The rapture of the believer. We already talked about that. And we're going to talk today about a war that will take place right after the rapture. The second thing is the tribulation, 7 years where God is going to judge the earth and spiritually restore the Jews. And then the second coming, praise God, when Jesus comes, Battle of Armageddon and all that. And then the 1,000-year kingdom that'll finally come. And then the eternal kingdom. It's interesting, though, as we read all of this in Luke chapter 21, the rapture's already happened, the tribulation hasn't started, and in verse 12 it says, but before all this. All right, so before the tribulation and after the rapture, there's a major attack on Israel. And I believe it's precipitated by the fact that America is taken out of the picture, no longer protecting Israel. There was a speech a couple years back by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli president. And he was looking at images of the concentration camps and what happened to the Jews. They were skin and bones. And it said, quote, they looked like walking skeletons, bones and bones. And he referred to Ezekiel 37, which talks about this. And many of you have heard things about them bones, them dry bones. And Ezekiel 37 talks about it. Let me just read a little bit of this. I can't read all of this, but let me just get you into Ezekiel starting in chapter 37, verse 11. And then the prophet Ezekiel was told, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. And he was referring to the first captivity of the Jews in Babylon for 70 years. And then after that, the Jews would go into a long, long captivity. They would be away. They are spread out. And so for the last nearly 2,000 years since 70 AD, the bones have been scattered all over. There has been no active Israel. But God promised that one day they would be restored. Now, people keep reading this, and before Israel was put back in place in 1948, they said, it can't be referring to Israel. That will never happen. They are gone. They've been gone for 2,000 years. They nearly wiped out during the Nazi regime. And so it must be referring to the church. And everybody's tone, not everybody's, but the tone of a lot of people changed when in 1948, lo and behold, shock of all shocks, the bones are moving back to the land. Verse 12, therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. And then later on, after they're there, and this happens a little later in prophecy, I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken and I have done it. Well, there were two parts to this revelation. The bones would be brought back to the land. And Netanyahu said that's what happened after we were started as a nation. They started coming from all the nations. And those concentration camp Jews looked like bone piles coming into Israel. And so here's what happened. Verse 7. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. And I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them. But here's a key statement. But there was no breath in them. So the bones are there. But Israel, the Jews as a whole, have not accepted Christ. Now, starting in chapter 38, there is an incredible battle. And it has been called the Battle of Gog and Magog. And people say, well, doesn't that occur at the end of the millennium? There is a battle of Gog and Magog at the end of the millennium. This one, I believe, is separate and distinct. And the nations that are called out by their historical names are the nations that we would expect would attack Israel if the U.S. was not here. Why are they different? Let me just go ahead and give you. Some of you are Bible students. You say, no, I don't know if that's really the case. Well, Ezekiels Battle, we're going to see, occurs before the 1,000-year millennium. Revelation, that's the one at the end of the millennium, happens at the conclusion of the millennium, 2 different time periods. Ezekiel's will occur soon after the rebirth of the state and the ingathering of the Jewish people. Revelation occurs after Jesus has reigned on the earth for 1,000 years. Totally different time. Ezekiel's involves a limited coalition of countries that surround Israel, whereas Revelations involves all of the nations, it says, from every corner of the earth. In Ezekiel's, life continues afterwards. Bodies are gathered and buried, it says, for 7 months, and the weapons are gathered and burned for 7 years. Makes it sound like this is just before the tribulation starts, doesn't it? I believe it is. Revelations, however, brings in life eternal, the lake of fire for the unsaved, etc. Separate and distinct. So who are the members of this axis of evil? All right, I'm going to finish this up, and I'm not going to go into the details. If you want a copy of this, just email me, use Facebook to get a message to me. I'll send you a copy with all of the notes in it so that you can have all of these. Gog and Magog means the prince of Russia. Meshech means Moscow. Tubal, we read in there, is Turkey. And then Persia is obviously Iran and parts of Syria. And then there's Sudan and Libya, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, possibly Afghanistan and Pakistan. It gives a list of all of the combatants, and it gives all of their old names. But when we translate that to modern times, it's a Muslim coalition surrounding Israel. Well, A number of things need to happen before that occurs. Israel needs to be in the land. They're there. Israel must be prosperous. They are there. Israel must be at peace in the land. I don't know if they are really there yet, but we're getting there. Now, it ends in Ezekiel 39. I would encourage you to read Ezekiel 37, 38, and 39. You will see names in there that, like Tugarma, that mean nothing to you, but trust me, these are names of countries that are Muslim countries that surround Israel at this point in time, or at least are hostile toward Israel. They all descend upon Israel, the mountains of Israel. And then we read in Ezekiel 39, God steps in, God fights for them. Doesn't need America this time. God fights for them because the Jews are not going to leave the land. And you say, okay, that's really a great story. So what? All right, the main thing I wanted you to see today is the impact of the rapture. This war can take place because of the rapture, which means the rapture needs to take place before that. And then we're going to see next week that we will enter 7 years of tribulation. Now, I've taught Revelation many times. I've talked about the tribulation. I am committed that it will be a summary, because if I start talking about 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 vials of wrath, I'm going to lose you in the weeds on it. So I'm going to give you an overview and say, here are the lessons we need to know and why it's important that Christians who say, I'm not going to be there, why do I care about that? Well, you're going to have friends and relatives that are. And you need to know certain things that you can share with them as they prepare for it. And as the Christians, who we're going to see next week, there will be the greatest revival. There will be more evangelism. It'll be the great awakening during the tribulation. You say, well, how's that going to get done? I'm going to answer that question next week also. We'll talk about the evangelism explosion of the tribulation. Well, I hope this gave you some meaning. The key thing is the impact of the rapture and the fact that the things we see coming up in the tribulation and coming up in this battle in Ezekiel, 100 years ago, people would look at it and say, none of this is reasonable, it is not feasible, and there is no Israel. And why we today are in a privileged time where we can look at it and say, the pieces are there. And so the rapture is much more imminent than it has ever been. My challenge to you is, are you ready? And have you shared your readiness with those around you? Have you shared your faith? Are you secure in your faith? Do you question your faith? And I would ask that you talk to your pastor, that you talk to God in prayer, so that you know that if it could happen, and it will happen in the twinkling of an eye, the rapture, that you are confident that you would go to be with Christ, be absent from the body, and be present from the Lord. I look forward to talking to you next week. I know I probably raised more questions than I answered. Don't be afraid to email me your questions. I'm getting them every week, and I'll try to address them in this presentation. No guarantees. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.